Guys, and today I'm going to be reading Mr. Nosey by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Nosey liked to know about everything that was going on. He was always poking his nose into other people's business. Mr. Nosey was the sort of person who, if they came upon a locked door, couldn't resist looking through the keyhole to see why the door had been locked. And there he is trying to look through. Mr. Nosey was the sort of person who, if he found an unopened letter addressed to somebody else, would simply have to open it to find out what was inside. And there he is with somebody else's letter. It's addressed to Mr. Brown. Mr. Nosey was the sort of a person who, if he was sitting reading his paper on a train, would much rather read the paper of the person sitting next to him. And there he is trying to read the next person's paper. I don't know why he doesn't just read his own. Naturally, as you might well imagine, Mr. Nosey was not very popular. People did not like the way in which Mr. Nosey would peek in and pry into their affairs. They did not like it at all, but did that stop Mr. Nosey prying and peeking? It did not. And there he is peeking through the window. Mr. Nosey lived in a funny, tall, thin house in a place called Tiddletown. The people of Tiddletown decided that Mr. Nosey was becoming much too nosy, and so they held a meeting to discuss what to do about him. And there's his house, very thin. "We must find some way of stopping him being so nosy," said Mr. Chips, the town carpenter. There's Mr. Chips. "That's right," said Mrs. Washer, who ran the Tiddletown laundry. "He needs to be taught a lesson." There's Mrs. Washer. "If only we could think of a way to stop him poking his nose into everything," said Mr. Brush the painter. And then a small smile spread over his face. "Listen," he said, now grinning. "I have a plan." And his friends gathered round to listen to his plan. And there he is, and that's Mr. Brush. The following morning, Mr. Nosey was out walking along Tiddletown High Street when he heard somebody whistling behind one of the closed doors. "I wonder what's going on there," he thought to himself, and tiptoed up to the door. He quietly opened it and peeped in. And there he is trying to peep through. Splash! Went a very wet paintbrush right on the end of Mr. Nosey's nose, covering it with bright red paint. "Oh dear, I am sorry," said Mr. Brush, who was painting the inside of the door. Poor Mr. Nosey had to go straight home to try and remove the red paint, which was very difficult and rather painful. Mr. Brush chuckled to himself. The plan had begun. And there he is with paint on the end of his nose. Poor Mr. Nosey. The following day, Mr. Nosey was walking past the laundry when he heard somebody laughing on the other side of the wall. "I wonder what's going on here," he thought to himself. And standing on tiptoe, he looked over the wall. There he is peeking over. Snap! Went a clothes peg right on the end of Mr. Nosey's nose. "Oh dear, I am sorry," said Mrs. Washer, who was hanging up clothes on a washing line on the other side of the wall. Poor Mr. Nosey removed the clothes peg, went off down the street feeling extremely sorry for himself and his poor red nose. Mrs. Washer chuckled to herself. The plan was working. There he is, bless him, with a peg on the end of his nose. The next day, Mr. Nosey was going past the fence when he heard hammering. "I wonder what's going on here," he thought to himself, and creeped very quietly to the edge of the fence He peeped round, and there he is trying to peep round the fence. Bang! Went a hammer, right on the end of Mr. Nose's nose. Aww. Oh dear. I am sorry, said old Mr. Chips, who was nailing up a loose plank in the fence. Poor Mr. Nosey had to go home immediately and bandage his poor red sore nose. Mr. Chips grinned a broad grin. The plan was working very well indeed. Poor Mr. Nosey with his bruised sore nose. The following day, Mr. Nosey was walking in the woods when he heard somebody sawing wood. I wonder what's going on here, he thought to himself, and he crept up behind the tree. He was just about to peer out from behind the tree when it suddenly occurred to him that if he did, something very nasty might happen to his nose. And so he went on his way without being nosy. And there he is in the woods. Behind the tree, with the saw raised in his hand, stood Mr. Herd the farmer. When he saw that Mr. Nosey had gone his way without being nosy, he laughed and laughed and laughed. The plan had worked. Mr. Herd hurried into Tiddletown to tell everybody, and there's Mr. Herd laughing his head off. The plan really had worked, because after that Mr. Nosey stopped being nosy and soon became very good friends with everybody in Tiddletown. And that is the end of the story, except to say, if you were ever tempted to be as nosy as Mr. Nosey used to be, you'd better expect one thing. There he is with all his new friends. A sore nose. And that is the end of Mr. Nosey.